Hello and welcome back to our online course, 17th Century English Research. My name is Ginevra Morse, Vice President of Education and Programming here at American Ancestors and New England Historic Genealogical Society. I will be moderating today's event. So in the first class, we discussed the historical context of 17th century England and the reasons why so many men, women, and children emigrated to New England and the colonies during that time. Today, we'll dive into some of the records that are available to us as family historians. And once again, we are thrilled to have as our instructor for the course, Else Churchill, a genealogist at the Society of Genealogists in the UK. She has 30 years experience as a professional genealogical librarian and researcher, and leads the SOG's education and publishing program, as well as being the Society's subject specialist. She has appeared on both the UK and American television show, Who Do You Think You Are?, and has written many articles for the British Genealogical Press, national media, and of course the Society's own Genealogist magazine. She lectures regularly for the Society of Genealogists, the National Archives, and for local groups around the UK, Canada, New Zealand, and the US. So as I mentioned, we'll look at just some of the records that you may turn to as a family historian, discussing what they are, what information is generally provided, and where to locate them. You'll find a PDF of today's slides at the online course page, as well as a detailed and lengthy handout. Starting tomorrow, you'll also be able to watch a recording of this presentation on that course page. And before moving on, I do want to note that we are, of course, broadcasting from our homes, and for the next few weeks from 2 different continents. We do apologize in advance if there are any interruptions, and we thank you for your patience. If we were to lose the connection for any reason, you still have access to an online or a full recording at that online course webpage. And a reminder to please make sure that you remain muted throughout the presentation. You will be able to ask questions by typing them into the chat panel, and Elsa will answer as many as she can during 3 Q&A sessions. All right, so without further ado, I will turn things over to our instructor.
Hello, Genevieve, and hello, everyone. Thanks for coming back for this second session. It's been really good to get in with you. And indeed, I've had some of you contacting me with questions about the course and raising points, and that's fine. I'm really delighted to engage with you. I should point out that a couple of people have tried to contact me as a professional searcher. That's not my role. That's not what the Society of Genealogists does. What I will do in the final session is give you 4 strategies and what to do. I'll give you some ideas on how to find people who can do research for you in the UK, and I'll explain how you can do that towards the end. I will answer any of the inquiries that those who have sent to me with similar information. As Jeanette says, we're really going to be looking at some of the sources and primary records of the 17th century in this session, where you can perhaps start doing your own research, because that's what's really much more fun than anything else. And all of the sources I'm going to be talking about in these sessions are really within this framework of who governed the lives of our 17th century ancestors, and how that governance in that hierarchical society that the English lived in would generate some remarkable records. And so we'll be looking in this particular session, in the next slide, Genevieve, on so three parts. The first part will be sort of parish registers, some elements of that, and then state papers, which are quite unuseful for the 17th century. Part 2, I'll be sort of expanding upon that idea of the families and networks at sort of local and county gentry level, and some of the records that will be associated with that kind of strata of society. And then for the third part, I'll be following on from the some of the comments I made last week about religious upheavals, the records relating to Quakers and Protestant dissenters, and of course the perennial records of tax. And so I'm kind of looking at a certain strata that link in today's sessions aren't really looking at the records of the very poor, particularly. I'll be leaving that more to sessions number 4, nearer towards the end. So let's start off with, in part 1, I'm going to kick off with the next slide, and just really the idea of parish registers being the records of baptisms, marriages and burials as recorded by the Church of England, recorded formally from 1538 in England and Wales. Of course, the sacrament of baptism, marriage and burial took place before 1538. It's the tenet of Christianity. It's just that we don't have particularly formal records thereof until Thomas Cromwell, in the reign of Henry VIII, instigated them as part of the great reforms for the establishment of Henry VIII being the head of the Church of England, and then the move towards the creation of the Church of England. Now, I'd dearly love to be able to tell you that you could trace your ancestors back to the beginnings of parish registers in 1538, but there are very few of the parish registers survive back that early. And in fact, only about 800 of the 12,000 or so parishes that existed at that time have records that go back that far. The records themselves are usually deposited for care in local county record offices, and the early church registers are very rarely kept by the church itself. There are 1 or 2 instances where the church does retain its records in archivally suitable accommodation, but in most cases the Church of England encourages the parishes to deposit their records. And many of the registers, but by no means all, have been transcribed and indexed by Family Search or other commercial websites. And more latterly, images are accompanying those transcriptions and indexes online. But I cannot stress enough that there is no one website that has all the records from surviving church registers in one place. You will indeed use several websites in conjunction with each other. And often the early registers, which are difficult to read, as you can see by the sort of scrawling, spidery handwriting that I've shown there, that is a register that actually survives from 1538. The early registers are often not included in the websites, and one of the things you really will need to do is to check gaps in coverage if you have an idea of place. And really, I cannot stress that place is, if there's any clue that you have in your research in America that can give you an idea of what places there are, you need to go back to start looking for the records of those places. As I said, there's about 12,000 separate parishes in England and Wales, each with records, but not always surviving back to 1538. Only about 800 parishes have records going back that far. Let's go on to the next slide. Now, one of the things that you have to understand is that the 17th century was a very dramatic period within the Church of England, and there are certain things that that can affect what genealogists might find in the registers at that time. Now, the constitution and rules governing the Church of England are known as the canon law, based on what is called very arcanely the canons, constitutions, and ecclesiastical, agreed upon with the king. By this time, in 1603, we have James the Sixth of Scotland and First of England on the throne. And in that year of our sovereign Lord, James, by the grace of God, King of England, France and Ireland the first, and of Scotland the 7th and 30th, is working with the bishops to lay down the rules governing the church, and these governed things like the matters of divine service and sacrament, how ministers were ordained and how they functioned, indeed how schoolmasters taught, because they were expected to teach and be licensed according to the tenets of the Church of England and be licensed by them. They govern things appertaining to the physical aspect of the church and the officials, whether it's the clergy and the parish clerks or the church wardens and indeed the sidesmen. It established how the ecclesiastical courts of the archbishops and bishops should govern their parishioners. It established how the judges judged their parishioners, and indeed the legal canon with officers such as proctors and registrars and apparitors. And I'll go into a little bit more about that in the when I'm looking at the church courts themselves. But in particular significance to genealogists, these canons, these laws, and there are 141 of them established in 1603 and enacted from 1604, that set down and regulated what the idea of the prohibited degrees of marriage, who could marry each other, and remember this is coming out of the time 2 generations on from Henry VIII's divorce from Catherine of Aragon on the grounds that she was technically his sister because she had been married to his brother. And so the idea of setting down in law the idea of consanguinity, who can marry and at what age the church allowed you to marry. And from a genealogist's point of view, the most important point is the age of consent is set down, where girls could be married with the permission of their parents from the age of 12 and boys from the age of 14. And indeed, this continues right through to the 20th century. And while it's probably rare for ordinary working class and middle class girls and boys to marry that young because they needed obviously to get jobs and save money and prepare themselves for life, in theory, these are the ages when people might be given permission to marry, and so you need to remember to be flexible when you're looking for marriages at that in this time. Next slide, please. And I would suggest that marriage is a challenge, particularly in the 17th century, when you're looking at church records. And there is an argument that the poor may not have married at all and may have cohabited more than we would suggest. For example, there's what we would almost think of to be a census in the late 1600s, listing in the city of Salisbury in Wiltshire all those who were in receipt of poor relief. And this indicated, when we're going through there, just how many people were probably not married at all. And there's just a few examples I've got here. A Morgan Percival and one Rebecca, to whom he says he was married, and their daughter, were sent back to Oxford from Salisbury in 1599. And in the same year, Thomas Wheeler, a wandering vagrant, was sent back to Romsey in Hampshire from Salisbury with Elizabeth Carpenter, a lewd woman whom he alleges to be his wife. And Humphrey Pierce and Margaret Hooper, living lewdly together and not married, were sent back to Southampton. And in 1631, James Grose was found wandering with Anne Woods, and they affirmed that she was his wife, but which on an examination proved not to be the case, and that they had one child that had died, and she was pregnant again. And at the very end, James Grobin is to be whipped openly, since she was lately Joan Grobin is to be whipped openly, since she was lately delivered in St Edmund's parish in Salisbury of a third bastard child, begotten upon her, as she affirms and confesses, by one Thomas Wyatt, later servant to John Voucher of Salisbury. She says that one Batin, a joiner, deceased, is the father of the first child, a son yet living, but she does not remember the name of the father. And the second child, a daughter, because she was the father is unknown, because he was a stranger to her, and as she had no punishment for the same, she's to be whipped for all three. Now, of course, we don't know what she means by stranger. We don't know whether she just had a fling or whether it was an assault. But either way, this poor woman is to be punished for her waywardness, and certainly this non-marital status is frequently commented on in this period in records that supplement the parish registers. Now, Another problem during the Civil War and the period of the interregnum in Parliament, that period between about 1645 and 1660, where that Parliament was attempting to, as it was in the ascendancy, to reform the administration of the Church in England and how marriage was governed. The bishops, the episcopal system was abolished, and hence the church courts were abolished, and this is what I'll go into in a bit more detail next week. But the licensing of marriages, which had been indeed enacted from the church authorities from the Reformation, pre-Reformation times. If there were no bishops, there could be no marriage licenses issued, and then we have fewer records relating to the legality of marriage in this period. And then, of course, with the establishment of the Directory of Common Worship, which replaced the Book of Common Prayer, it changes the way the church ceremonies work, and it was enacted that every parish or chapelry in the realm should appoint a register, and that's what we would nowadays call a registrar, to record marriages performed not by clergymen but by magistrates. And this register would be the fair register book for the names of all married, not, as I say, not by clergymen but by magistrates. And this fair book would be a new and separate book from the parish registers that we'd had for almost a century at this point. Next slide, please. And these new ideas about marriage particularly come with 1653, where they have the Act touching on the marriage and registering thereof, appointing this registrar, the register, to record marriages by justices of the peace. This is almost a forerunner of what we might consider to be civil registration of marriages that came in 1837, over 2 centuries later. And as we can see from a note in the Cerne Abbas parish registers, this Marriage Act touching on the marriages thereof was actually quite unpopular. At this time, it seems most people wanted God involved in their unions. So you may find that the implementation of this act touching on the marriages and registering thereof was implemented quite variously throughout England. Some places did enact the new book and did away with parish registers. Some decided they would carry on using the church register, but the marriages would be performed outside the church rather than inside the church by a clergyman. And so you will see a certain amount of variety, and you'll end up with gaps in the registers. Next slide, please. And it's quite common that there's gaps, particularly for marriages in the period we're looking for. It's quite rare to find the record of the justices or of the peace themselves performing a marriage. In fact, I only know of one rare instance of a surviving justice's notebook, being that of Captain John Pickering in where is he? In West Ardsley, in Yorkshire. It was published by the Thoresby Society, which is the Yorkshire Record Society, and it mentions that he has this notebook which covers the records of the marriages he performed between 1665 and 1655 and 1660. And an example, it says here on the 15th of September, it's mentioned that Will Barber and Mary Swindle were this day in the presence of Will Swindle of Merrifield and Thomas Baker of the same, and Edward Baker of the same, clothiers. The couple were duly married at West Ardsley before me. And so while it's very clear that these separate registers do exist, they are quite rare to find. And in the next slide, here's an example of the existing parish registers being used to record these registers by JPs. And here we have a note in the parish registers of Marshfield in Gloucestershire that on the 4th day of October in 1655, John Greway of the parish of Bitton and Mary England of this parish, being published in our church at Marshfields, according to the Act, were married at Marshfields before John Goslet, Esquire, a JP. And that's great if the registers themselves actually record this ceremony, even if the vicar didn't perform it. But in many cases, the records may not have got into the parish register. You might find that there's a note in a neighbouring parish register relating to a marriage that's taking place elsewhere. And so you might have to cast your search for evidences of marriages quite widely in the 17th century. Carrying on. And this gap in the register doesn't only come about because of the confusion of changing of marriage law in this period. The Civil War isn't a great time for the safekeeping of records. So thus the registers in St Mary and St Giles, Reading, and in Hilton in Dorsetshire have all sorts of comments which make us realise that we mean that there's a problem at this time. And so we have the comment, in time of war, people made use of whom they could get without minister, clerk or bell. And a confused time of war occasioned some confusion in the register. And in the time of the civil wars, he was, in this case they're talking about the vicar, by the power of the sword violently kept out of his living from 1646 till Michaelmas 1660, when by law he was restored to his living. He was brought back, this is the king, as King Charles II was. But in that time, i.e. between 1646 and 1660, in that compass of time, the register had been kept very imperfectly. And I'm sorry to say, this has become colloquially as what genealogists called the Commonwealth gap. This is something you're going to find in the middle of the parish registers, is that they are incredibly deficient. For example, we hold a transcript of the Register of Sholden in Kent, which has clearly been reconstructed from notes or later copies, and indeed what were known as bishops' transcripts, where copies of registers had been sent to the bishops from the 1590s and thus had not been subject to war or destruction or being hidden away. And so they could reconstruct this gap, which actually in this case meant a whole lacuna of entries from 1630 to 1660 had really gone astray. And again, the vicar makes a note that the book was lost for 5 years, being carried away, dissit, or so it is said, by Mr. Nichols when he was sequestrated, and came not to our hands till anno 1662, after my sequestration and restoration, and witness my hand, James Burville, the vicar of Sholden. And again, he makes a note, divers who were baptized at Sholden about these years were at Northbourne in the register books there, as you may see. So again, you might have a clue of a place, but if you've got an indication that the parish registers are deficient for that period, then it might be worth looking around at neighbouring parishes for some chance help and support to say what's going on, particularly if perhaps there wasn't a vicar in one parish, but the vicar next door decides he's going to keep a note and say what is happening. But I also should make mention of some of the terminology that you're seeing here. These are terms of the 17th century. Sequestration is a common punishment, which means essentially seizure of your estates. And that means seizure of your jobs, your assets, your estate in life. And people can lose their job. And this sequestration generates records, as we'll go on to look about when we look at state papers. And next slide, please. And in 1660, we have the restoration of Charles II. He was restored to the throne of England, and generally all the pre-Civil War legislation, canon law, was reinstated, and Parliament's ordinances and attempts to change, such as the Marriage Act of 1653, were thrown aside. The old parish registers were brought out of service had they survived. The entries recorded by registrars may well be retrospectively recorded in the parish registers, so it's quite possible that events taking place between 1653 and 60 might be noted in much later entries in the register. So again, cast your searches wider throughout the registers to see what's being noted. And of course, there are lingering effects of this shaking of the marriage regulations in the 17th century. With the abolition of the bishops and their restoration in the 1660s, there were a number of places that kind of wanted to continue this this idea of being free of the bishop. And indeed, there were many places in London which considered themselves to be free of the Bishop of London, and because of this freedom, they considered themselves to be what might be called liberties. They became popular marrying places that could that would attract people to marry in their parish, which were not technically according to the canon law, but nevertheless had an element of validity. And so in London, we have places like St James Duke Place, which between 1664 and 1691 records in its parish registers over 40,000 marriages, many more than the parish itself would be likely to support through its own population. And indeed, towards the end of the century, the rector of St James Duke's Place was suspended from his living for 3 years because he consistently performed marriages for anyone without calling the banns or issuing a license. And there were other places like Holy Trinity Minories, the area around the Tower of London, St Bishop's Aldgate. It too, because it had essentially been a place where there'd been a priory, and the precinct around the priory considered itself to be a liberty or free of the bishop, and it too was the place for many marriages, and it's suggested that St James Duke's Place and Holy Trinity Minories accounted for half of the weddings taking place in London between 1664 and 1696. So again, if you're in London and you're looking in the city, then these two parishes are absolutely something you should look out for. Towards the end of the century, in the 1690s, the regulations were tightened up, and these places like St James Duke's Place, the Minories, and St Bossups Aldgate became less of a magnet for marriages. But that left in London the Fleet Prison, the liberties, and around the Fleet Prison, and within taverns, alehouses, and brandy shops, indebted vicars and clergymen who were technically imprisoned for debt were performing marriages around this area. And so after the 17th century, in the 18th century, the big marrying hotspot becomes the liberty of the Fleet Prison. And somebody asked a question about Gretna Green. After I will just distract myself briefly. After 1753 and Hardwicke's Marriage Act, the Fleet Prison too was the rules were tightened up, and so this ceased to be a place where marrying hotspots occurred, and hence you had to go to Scotland, places like Gretna Green, after the 1750s to have your irregular marriages. So Gretna Green isn't something of the 1600s, it is something that happens from the late 18th and 19th century. But there are other places outside London in the 17th century where you might find these marrying places. next slide please, such as Tong in Kent or Dale Abbey in Derbyshire. And here we have the Vicar of Tong in 1667. He was prosecuted because of his practice of regularly marrying people without following the regulations of the church. He did not make the announcements of bans on 3 consecutive Sundays. He did not ensure they had a license. And so it is possible that you might find vicars being prosecuted for this practice, and that gives you a clue. Well, right, my ancestors come from Kent. Maybe I should start looking for marriages more in Tong, because this is a place we knew where the vicar was essentially misbehaving and doing things he shouldn't have done. So that's really all I want to say about parish registers. Just to warn you that, if you're particularly looking for marriages, it's always a challenge throughout the century, and particularly in the period from about 1640 to 1660, we've got this dreadful period called the Commonwealth Gap, where they're just very, very poorly kept. So let's go on to state papers. We saw how the Vicar of Sholden talked about his sequestration and restoration. Now, sequestration was the seizure of jobs, assets and estates of the recusants and royalist sympathisers by Parliament. And of course, Parliament essentially won the Civil War and punished their opponents who lost. And it was a particular aspect of 17th century rule. And there are some remarkable records that show what happened to these royalist recusants. And these are found in the records of the parliamentary committees within the state papers. Now, the state papers are the records of government. Before we had the National Archives, it was the Public Record Office. And before the Public Record Office was called the Public Record Office, it was called the State Papers Office. So the King's Secretaries of State before the Civil War would have state papers. The King's Secretary of State after the Civil War have state papers. And of course, Parliament in its ascendancy throughout in the period of the Commonwealth and Protectorate also has state papers. And I just want to talk about some of the records of the parliamentary committees in this period, notably the Committee for Sequestrations, the Committee for Compounding with Delinquents, the Committee for Plundered Ministers, and the Committee for Advance of Money. I just love 17th century language. Let's go on to the next slide. There are some fantastic research guides about state papers, particularly the state papers domestic for the period 1642 to 60, the government papers of the Civil War and the interregnum, how the Parliament governed Crown, Church and Royalist lands. But again, you can see there are state papers domestic before the Civil War, for the Tudor and Stuart governments from 1547. And you really need to read yourself, to read these research guides from the National Archives. That's what TNA stands for. The National Archives, it's our abbreviation for our National Archives, and that's where you'll find some of these records for the various parliamentary committees that ran the country during this period. And on the next slide is probably some of the most important name-rich records. We have the Committee for Sequestration. It sat between 1643 and 1649, and it administers the estates which had been seized from those who were accused of having voluntarily helped the royalist cause in the Civil War, or of being Catholic. The seizure or confiscation of this land, of these estates, was quite methodical. Any movable goods were to be inventoried and sold off. The landed property was to be leased for the profit of state. If there any income was coming in from rentals, it would be listed. And how did you find out if somebody was a royalist sympathiser. Well, that you would rely on their neighbours to inform upon them. And so, rather than go out and detect this, they would encourage people to inform on their neighbours. And if this delinquency, as it was called, is a wonderful 17th century term. I always think delinquents are what the gangs do in the 1950s in West Side Story, but no, it's not juvenile delinquents. It's just anyone who the state deems is a wrong un. So if this delinquency was proven, the owner was permanently deprived of his estate and property, but he would have a fifth of it given back to maintain his children, and another fifth went to the informant. So that's a good reason to encourage your neighbours to inform upon you. But what happened, of course, is if you seize all this land and property and you try and sell it off, if you put a glut of anything into the market, the prices fall and rental cease to provide any income. And so they decided this was a really silly idea. So let's stop seizing and selling the land. Let's just value the estate and fine the owners of this land and property with a negotiation as to the value of its worth, and we would call that compounding. And so they set about a separate committee to compound with these delinquents, and this committee merged with the Committee for Sequestration, and the Committee for Compounding would then start open a negotiation with the people it was punishing. It had its headquarters in Goldsmith Hall in London, but it had outlying offices, for want of a better word, in all the counties. And initially, Catholics and the King's political advisors were not allowed to come and negotiate and be fined instead of having their land seized, but that fell to pieces. And so from 1644, everybody was allowed to come and negotiate, which meant, although their estates were technically seized, they could come and sacrifice part of the estate to safeguard the rest and protect themselves and pay a compounding amount of money. Now, this sounds quite technical, but what it meant was that there's lots and lots of paperwork, anything that involves the valuation of lands, how much they're worth, and value, and can contain huge amounts of information that family historians are fascinated in. It will tell you if there are any pre-debts and encumbrances on the estate that had to be taken into consideration. And there are 266 volumes of these papers, of all these negotiations, known as the Proceedings of the Committee for Compounding. And these papers of the Committee for Sequestrations and the Committee for Compounding have all been indexed and what we call calendared, i.e. listed, for the whole period that this went on, from 1643 to 1660, by a lovely lady called Mary Ann Everett Green, who I could give an hour's lecture on as being a remarkable Victorian historian, but she was typical of this Victorian interest in the Civil War, and she went through all these state papers and created this wonderful synopsis of them. So I'm going to use her synopsis of them to show you an example of what the précis in the calendar gives of this negotiations for compounding. So here we have the papers relating to Edward Farnham of Quandon in County Leicestershire, and it's his compounding in October 1645. And we know that he is fined £400. But we've got a précis of what actually leads up to this fine. He says that he admits, I am a prisoner in Leicester for residing in the King's quarters and wishing to partake of Parliament's favour, beg an order to the County Committee to come and attend to my crime and to the value of my estate. And they say, of course, yes, come along. And he says, well, I'd like to compound for my delinquency, but can I please come to Ashby de la Zouch rather than go all the way down to London? Because that's only 9 miles away where I live. And they say, yes, that's fine. And he's fined in 1646, £480. And they say, well, this will be suspended if you pay us half up front straight away. And then he comes back in 1647 and said, actually, did you take into consideration that I'd sold 80 acres? And in fact, this land is only worth 300 quid a year, and I'm paying too much. Now, this is the bald outline, and it all sounds a bit dry until you start to actually look at the records. And this is what the records look like. They're all handwritten. They're all in the old State Papers Office, and they're now at the National Archives. So go on to the next slide, please. Now, luckily, we don't have to read the original records, because these sequestration records of Edward Farnham have been published, and we have them in the library at the Society of Genealogists, and they're also available through the Family Search Catalogue, so you can download a digital copy if you want to go through them and see the typical things they say. Now, within them, you find all of these negotiations that I talk about. He talks about the value of the estate. If we go on to the next slide, Genev, he goes on to point out that his father left the estate horribly indebted and encumbered by a mortgage, and he brings his father's will as evidence thereof. And Edward has 4 brothers who he has to support from the proceeds of the estate, and he goes on to tell us about these 4 brothers. One of the brothers fought on the side of Parliament. This is a family divided. So he's actually trying to say to the parliamentary committee, by the way, somebody was on your side, and so he's making a big thing of this. And then his wife pops up and says, I haven't got my fifth that you were supposed to give me, and I've got these children to look after. And he goes on to say how he's had to sell land to pay his taxes. Now, at this point, next slide, please. You might be coming to complain to me that you haven't got landowning families with estates that could be seized by Parliament, because your ancestors were poor and impoverished yeomen and tenant farmers, or indeed even cottagers and agricultural labourers. But within all of the estates of Edward Farnham is a record of all his tenants. It's almost a census of every peculiar of the messuages, houses, lands, tenements and herediments of Edward Farnham of Corndon in the county of Leicester, and the yearly values thereof according to the profits and rents made by him, made and received for the last 6 years. And there we have on the right hand side a list of all his tenants, almost like a census of the people living on his lands in Corndon and in the various parishes on Mount Sorrel and Woodhouse. The estates were quite vast. And there we can see there is the Widow Peakes is mentioned at the end of Mount Sorrel's listing there. She's renting a cottage to the value of a guinea, £1, 1 shilling. And also in Mount Sorrel, at the top of the listing for Mount Sorrel, we have a farm being rented by George Thornton to the value of £32 a year. So sort of his tenant farmers and his poor cottagers on his estate are all listed. And this may be some of the only clues you have of where your ancestors might be living and being alive at a certain time, at a certain place. In the middle of that big gap in the parish registers here in the 1640s, we know almost a census of who's living where. And again, if you can establish who are the landowners in the areas you're researching, you might find evidence thereof. Now, sequestration is only really prevalent for those who lost the Civil War. The Royalist sympathisers. And so you would need, and I'll tell you a bit later on how you can establish if your area had a lot of royalist sympathisers. And we know much more about the royalists who lost the Civil War than those who were in the ascendancy winning side. But remember, according to the romantic migrants to Virginia, it's the younger sons of these royalist families who were supposedly the migrants to Virginia. Next slide, please. And these composition papers are well known. They're often published by the county record societies. So if you've got an idea of the counties where your ancestors may have come from, and you're thinking that there may be families around this period, here we've got the Royalist composition papers, as they're known, from the Committee for Compounding in the county of Lancaster, published by the Lancashire County Record Society. And again, you can see here that you've got the papers relating to Robert Barlow of Urmston, and it'd been informed by him by others that he had been a royalist, and the committee took him up and fined his lands. Carry on, next slide please, because I'm talking too much about this. Now, many of the state papers, the other sort of state papers domestic leading up to the Civil War and after the Civil War, are actually online, but not these papers for sequestration and compounding, sadly. So there is the State Papers Online website, which is only available through universities and at the National Archives in London, where you can do name searches on state papers. And some of the later state papers after the Civil War, I should mention the calendar for compounding is on British History Online, and those 4 volumes are the précis that I showed you, and the index with the names is in volume 5. So you can find that on the British History Online website, which is produced by the Institute of Historical Research. British History Online is a good place to start for searching later state papers, and particularly the state papers relating to the Colonial Office. The state papers of the Colonial, America and West Indies from 1574 up to 1739. They're on British History Online. And this is that gives detail of the wide-ranging documents relating to the American and West Indian colonies, and their transcripts and summaries of the documents. They can be correspondence between the various governors and the secretaries of state. It could be correspondence within the Board of Trade. The reason for having the colonies is essentially to foster trade, and all of these records with the merchant companies and, for example, the registers of the surviving licenses to pass beyond the seas. These come from the colonial records and the exchequer records, and they're listed within these calendars of state papers. They include the Board of Trade for New England, the Board of Trade for the Plantations, the Board of Trade for the Americas and the West Indies and Bermuda, and the colonial papers. There's a very good, indeed excellent, research guide from the National Archives of these state papers that explains how they work. And if we have a look at some examples of things you can just find from the calendars on the next page. So I've just taken a few samples from the calendars, which are again a nice brief synopsis that can lead you back to the original records at the National Archives. For example, in 1625, there are some records within the State Papers Colonial relating to correspondence with the Mayor and Alderman of Southampton to the Privy Council, getting permission to set forth a vessel to send to Virginia under the captaincy of Captain Whitaker and Grindle and Mr. Coe, the master, setting forth from London to that colony. And while you're not necessarily getting the names of the people who are on the ship, other than the master and his immediate crew, it's giving you an idea. If you have got the ship's captains that you're supposed to be looking for, then this might be a place to start looking at. And indeed, there's some to New England, a list of 20 patents issued for plantations granted to Sir Ferdinand George and Captain W. Mason and others between 1622 and 1628, entitled, I love this, a catalogue of such patents as I know granted, which makes me worried that there's lots of patents that were granted for plantations in New England that they just didn't know about. So I'll take a brief pause there.
All
for
right.
any questions?
Yes. So a few questions. So Joanne asks, how we, once you find something in an index for the parish records, how do you actually then locate the parish record itself?
The parish records themselves will be in the appropriate county record office. So if, for example, you've just found an index parish register, but you know the parish and the name of the county, then just look in the county record office, and that's where the originals will be. Family Search will probably have a copy of it, that it's been microfilmed and or digitized, that you can go straight to through a family Family Search affiliate library that might be close to you, and more recently the images are getting online. But as I say, if you've just found an indexed entry without an image, then you may have to go back to the county record office where the original records are.
All right. And Jacqueline asks, so when an ancestor has a surname that's also a name of a town or a place, does it kind of follow then that the ancestor is from that location?
Yes, but probably much earlier than you are researching. Surnames get more fixed in the 1100s and the 1200s. So it's quite possible that somebody called Mr. Wigton's family did come from a place called Wigton, but by the time of the 17th century, they've been in a lot more places than Wigton in the earliest. So you cannot jump 200 years. If you're researching in 1600, you can't jump to that town 200 years earlier and expect to find an individual. It doesn't work that way.
All right. And Brian asks if there's a resource to find the parish names of a particular county that existed in the 1600s, or is it safe to assume that parishes that exist today are those that existed in the 17th century?
No, there are a lot more parishes. A lot more parishes were created after the 17th century to reflect the population changes, but a definitive list of all the parishes, I would suggest you start with perhaps Family Search's maps, Family Search, Family Search. They call it the 1851 jurisdictions of England, but it will tell you what ancient parishes there were. The Phillimore Atlas and Index of Parish Registers. There's possibly the Genuki website. Those, and there are plenty of places which will give you a list of the ancient parishes in a county which were in existence in the 1600s. If you get access, if you know the county, then look at the Phillimore Atlas and Index of Parish Registers, which has some fantastic maps showing you the parish in relationship to each other and all the parishes in a county and which are the neighbouring parishes, etc.
All right. And Michael says, we've talked about parish registers in terms of marriage. What about other, baptisms, births, deaths, particularly for the Civil War period? Would you find those at kind of the local county record offices, or?
Well, you find them, the parish registers. Yes, the parish registers are in the county record office, and many of them are indexed. So baptisms, marriages, and burials should be recorded. I just stressed how there are many problems with marriages, and you've got the gap in the middle of the 17th century because of the Civil War. But yes, baptisms, marriages are the lifeblood of family history at this period. Yes.
All right. Just a few more questions. Renee asks, how prevalent are the sequestration papers that list tenants?
depends how much they had to seize. Some, if they are a big manorial landowning family, then the tenants are an asset. So one of the things I'm going to go on to suggest is finding out what was going on in your area for the Civil War, establish the landowners, see if the landowners were involved in the Civil War, and then look them up in the index to the calendars and see what there is.
And I mean, Kelly asks a kind of a follow-up question to that. I mean, how do you establish those landowners where your ancestors lived?
I'm going to kind of come to that in a minute.
Okay. And then one final question, Paul asks, why would the poor avoid marriage? Were there high fees or other reasons?
Lots of other reasons, I think. I'm trying to think. This could be an hour's lecture in its own right.
Lots of other reasons.
I think, yeah, there is a certain amount of not being able to afford church fees. There are being so poor, and that you are mobile and indigent, and from the middle of the 1500s and throughout the 1600s, vagrancy, for example, is a real issue. People moving around, if you're moving around and you're dossing and so you're just leading such a destitute life. You can't actually, you want to avoid the church.
All right. So let's move on to part 2, and I know that we'll get to some of the items that have come up through the questions. So back to you.
Okay, I'm going to have to talk quickly because I've got quite a lot to do in this time. I wanted to talk about the networks that these families, these sort of landed families, might have worked in. The gentry families and the records associating with that kind of strata of society. So let's go on and straight on to talk about the heraldic visitations. They are some of the most important sources for genealogical information for our midgets and minor gentry families, and those middle class families who prospered by buying lands and property and status after the dissolution of the monasteries a century earlier in the 1530s. And so we'd had an opportunity to start creating a middle class. And so the idea of having to prove yourself a gentleman by showing that you had the right to bear arms, the definition of a gentleman was someone who had a coat of arms, meant that the heralds instituted this idea of visitation being to prove the right that you were a gentleman, and that your descent from the person who had been granted a coat of arms. And these visitation records generated a collection of pedigrees of families recorded from the early 16th to the early 17th century, but in many cases extending much further back. And although they're a valuable source, they must be used with great care, because they were reliant on people giving their own version of their family history. And so you need to substantiate what the pedigrees say by confirming, if you can, from contemporary records that these people were born or baptized at a certain place. From the early 16th century to the late 17th century, the heralds carried out visitations county by county, regulating the coat of arms. Most counties were visited several times during this period. So you can see something like at the visitation of London would occurred in 1568, 1593, 1633, 1666 and 1687, or Derbyshire 1611, 1634 and 1662. So pretty much there's nearly always a visitation before or after the Civil War. Those who were allowed arms
Else, I think we lost you.
Sorry, has that come better?
Yes.
Okay. So where did you lose me? Was I talking about what the visitations contained?
Yes.
The
Yep.
pedigrees, and they recorded the main line of descent with any offshoots of their ancestry of their wives, in case they were from heraldic families, and they would illustrate the route by which a coat of arms had been acquired. And any dates and ages can be a bit fluid, and you just to say need to try and substantiate them if they can. But sometimes the heralds did record evidence that the pedigree was based on, so there might be a charter or a seal or evidence of the arms copied from churches and monuments, and they are quite scholarly. So if you go, for example, here to the Visitation of London, you can see some excellent evidences here. This version of the Visitation of London, begun in 1687, is some remarkable scholarly work. It's tried to corroborate the research from other sources. And so the later editions published by the Harleian Society are actually very scholarly. Some of the earlier editions published by the Harleian Society are not quite as accurate. But you can find many of these heraldic visitations on the internet. If we go to the next slide, there's the Internet Archive has many of the published versions of the heraldic visitations, because they've been around for over 100 years, and so many are printed. And in addition to the Internet Archive, if you go to another website on the next slide called the Medieval Genealogy website, it's actually, it has much later links here than you'd expect, and it has a link to every printed visitation that you can find online, where you will find copies of them and related heraldic reference books. So this is a way of finding a lot of those pedigrees that were generated by the heraldic visitations of the heralds, and these are often the sources of a lot of the early 17th century pedigrees that you will come across in Family Tree and Wiki and all the other places where people have uploaded family pedigrees without sources. This might be some of the sources they've used. And of course, the county visitation pedigrees do show the family relationships, the marriages, the families marrying into each other in cousinships. And these networks extend into what genealogists call, how to identify the families, the association, and the networks they involve themselves with. So for example, you might look at their education. You might look at the fact that the men who had coats of arms and who were gentlemen would form the backbone of the local JPs and the magistracy. They would then become the professions and be educated at the Inns of Courts. And in the cities, in London, they would be merchants and artisans who were members of the guilds and city livery companies, who traded and invested in I would say merchant venture projects to send people and invest in the colonies. So let's have a look at some of these records relating to those networks. Education. The endowed grammar schools date back to the 16th century, and there are occasionally records of them. And then we have what you would call a private school, and which we would call a public or an independent school. Many of these had their origins in the 16th, 17th century, and it's only in the 18th century that they become what we call public schools. But either way, these were educating the sons of the gentry and the merchant class. And here on the next slide, for example, the records of the local grammar school of Bury St Edmunds. This is called the Edward VI. It was given a charter by Edward VI, who provided that the town could establish a grammar school, and these have records from 1550 right into the Victorian period, but you can find 17th century gentry families educating their sons, and the biographical record, who they were, who their father was, and indeed, in this case, you can see entries for John and Nicholas Batley, who were both sons of Nicholas Batley, an apothecary. They both went on to university, and they both went on to become clergymen. And so again, if you know that, if you have an idea of the place and it's a small town, to see, you know, in the 17th century, where were they educated? Look for the records of the grammar school. If they go on to university in the 17th century, we only had two universities. These were the universities of Oxford and Cambridge, but they're both what we call a collegiate system, whereby these universities had several independent colleges within them. We're lucky that we have very detailed records of alumni for Oxford and Cambridge universities, and these are very easily found online through various websites. So we have the alumni records for Alumni Oxoniensis, published 1500 to 1714. And again, clergymen, people who were indeed some of the nonconformist families had their origins in education and theology before they broke with the Church of England, and you do see records of some divines and theologians mentioned in the university records, and again they can be informative about who the father was when they matriculated, i.e. when they joined the university, and indeed some biographical information about what we know about them later. It's from the Alumni Oxoniensis, and Alumni Cantabrigiensis is on ancestry. And again, I've got a 19th century one on the left, but on the right I've got a 17th century. Again, sometimes all they tell you is when they matriculated or joined the university. In this case, James Bacon joined as what was called a sizer, age 15. He's kind of working his way through college. He's actually a slightly poorer boy, and he's got a kind of work placement at the university. And we know that he joins the university in 1676. Sometimes that's all you find, is the fact that they have joined the university. Sometimes there's more biographical material. Of course, another way of networking would be through the professions. And rather than go to university, many of the barristers were and lawyers of the 17th century trained in what we call the Inns of Courts. So you have the admission registers for Lincoln's Inn, Middle Temple and Inner Temple, and Gray's Inn. These are the main places where lawyers trained at the bar of these Inns of Court, and those records are largely going online or published. And again, these are, you can see the networks of the professional people, the clergymen, that they're all of that intermingling connection. Next slide, please. And of course, the church would be seen as a suitable career for the younger sons of these gentleman families. And as many were Oxbridge educated, they were also licensed to preach according to the canons and tenets of the Church of England, and presented to their livings by the bishops. And those records will be in the bishop's church court records. And drawing from those is a database known as the Clergy Database. Clergybase.org. It has some significantly big dioceses like Lichfield and Oxford and Salisbury and Coventry and Carlisle. In fact, I think there are many more diocesan records listed in there, and this is a good way of starting to look to see if you have a clergyman in your family history, whether there will be ecclesiastical licenses in those records, whether they will be in the alumni of Oxford and Cambridge. And there is a separate list of notes on clergymen compiled by Joseph Foster, known as Index Ecclesiasticus. His papers have gone to Cambridge University. And again, Foster's Index Ecclesiasticus is a good place to start looking if you have a place that you think you have a 17th century clergyman in your research. I was asked a few questions last week about London being the biggest city in the 17th century and attracted so many people into its orbit, encouraged so many migrants to leave. And so I really recommend looking at some useful timelines for what's going on in 17th century London, and have a look at Cliff Webb's book, My Ancestors Were Londoners. It's a really good, useful reference work to have to hand. Remember the chartered companies which invested in the American colonies, such as the Virginia Company, the Plymouth Company, the London and Bristol Company, the Massachusetts Bay Company, the Hudson Bay Company, the Royal African Company. These original records are in the colonial records at the National Archives. But the people who invested in these are not only the Crown and members of the court and aristocracy, but they also drew finance from the London merchants and financiers from the City of London. And these financiers are often freemen of the City of London who'd gained their voting rights to elect the mayor and the Corporation of London by being free of a guild. So you'd have to be a freeman of a guild or city livery company before you could become a freeman of the city. And there are incredible records of how you became a freeman of the guild by serving an apprenticeship or being the son of a freeman or marrying a freeman's daughter, and in some instances buying your way in by purchase. Now, records of these activities of being a freeman of the guild or city livery company and then going on to being a freeman of the City of London are in the Corporation of London's records, which are at the London Metropolitan Archives. So that's worth having a look at. And then the Guildhall Library has guild records as well. I'm just going to make mention of some special collections at the Society of Genealogists. The work of the Reverend C.T. Gale. He's gone through a lot of these records of the guilds and city livery companies, particularly in the 1640s, those who paid taxes, known as the poll tax, and those who were in some of the state papers office from the 1640s. These are from tax records recorded with the Stationers' Company, and the Stationers' Companies, again, is a kind of a company that was recording formal papers in relation to the state, as well as sort of copyright things and things like that. And so these are good sources for some guilds and city livery companies. And in 1638, he has edited what was called an Inhabitants of London. This is a list of householders, parish by parish within the City of London, recording the rent and tithe data that they paid from some 93 parishes in the City of London. And this is from original records at Lambeth Palace, because they were paying tithe to the Archbishop of Canterbury, and that's how those records were recorded. Another huge collection at the Society of Genealogists, which is good for the 17th century, are those by Percival Boyd. These are online from the Society's SOG data online, and he compiled a fantastic marriage index with lots of 17th century entries. He compiled a huge burial index and some 60,000 notes on some 60,000 families, largely in London before 1700, known as Boyd's Inhabitants of London. And the next slide shows you what I mean by Boyd's Inhabitants of London. These are his handwritten notes I've said 20,000 families there, but that's wrong. It's 60,000. That's a typo. I'm terribly sorry. They're all these handwritten notes, many of them from the 17th century, from all sorts of London records. And you will find that on SOG Data Online and Find My Past. And these notes have been abstracted as pedigrees, and you'll find them on the next slide. They've been extracted onto Family Search. You'll find them within the Family Search Genealogies section, almost like submitted pedigrees, and or you can search by name in those, or you can go to the what they call the pedigrees with index of London citizens. This is what Boys Inhabitants used to be called before it was before we renamed it as London's Boys Inhabitants of London. And so that's how it's described on Family Search, but it's our collection that you can view as well. Okay. And outside London, many of the provincial boroughs and towns, such as York, Coventry, Warwick, Leicester, Ipswich, Norwich, Bury St Edmunds, etc., they too had freemen who had similar rights and responsibilities as in London. And you become a freeman of these places in a similar way by serving an apprenticeship, or being the son of a freeman, or by marrying a freeman's daughter, or buying your way in. And these have records of the admission registers to showing you how they gained their freedom, and if they gained them by apprenticeship, then you will find the apprenticeship records themselves. And many of these are published. It's worth checking the Society of Genealogists catalogue or the Family Search catalogue by doing a search for Freeman and seeing if these come up. And indeed, Find My Past has started getting a few with York, Norwich, etc. have started to go online as well. I can't stress how much you need to get a sense of place when you're researching in the 17th century. And it really does, you asked earlier on, how do I find out about who the landed families might be in the area where I'm researching? So you would need to look, for example, to see is there a Victoria County history for the county you're interested in, because that will often tell you what was going on in the 17th century, how it was affected by the Civil War. There may be older antiquarian county histories, again, looking very much at the landowning families in those areas. If you can get a feel for where your ancestors might have lived, who their landlords were, you can perhaps start following up those families. And here, for example, there's well, can I just go back a bit, Genevieve? Go back to that previous slide a bit. Here in Herefordshire, just from examples of sources if you're studying the Civil War period in Herefordshire, the Duncombe's History and Antiquities of the County of Hereford, published in 1804, is what I mean by one of these classic antiquarian histories, which would be an idea of finding out what the manors were in the area, who the landowners might be. And then if you are interested in the Civil War, there was lots of histories of what was going on in the Civil War in that county. I've used Herefordshire as an example. You could probably find very similar things for every county you are researching. Next slide, please. So from for example, Webb's Memorials of the Civil War in Herefordshire, he tells me about the places where my ancestors come from, in this case, a Scottsbrook, a hamlet in St. Wenards, where my ancestors were living. And although I can't find the names of my ancestors, I can find that some Scots parliamentary soldiers were found stealing from an oven from a woman in that hamlet in 1640s, and she killed him with a hatchet. So don't mess around with the 17th century women in my parish. And I'll talk in more depth next week about how you can find petitions, and there are sort of the voices of people petitioning in the Civil War. And the last thing I wanted to say about the Civil War were the Thomason Tracts from the British Library, which has 22,000 pamphlets, broadsides, manuscripts, broadsheets, effectively the 17th century newspapers reporting the Civil War. And there are huge primary sources for the political, religious upheavals, and you can now search these by name. They're on a website called Early English Books Online. They're being digitized, and this is a way in to start seeing what is going on in that period.
All right, let's pause here again for some questions. So Deborah asks, was there a draft at the beginning of the Civil War, and would avoiding conscription be a reason to leave England?
Yes, effectively you were. If your landowner formed a regiment, you were expected to join it. Yeah, if you did what your landlord told you to do. And so, but one of the reasons the Civil War caused huge upheaval, particularly for those who are on the wrong side, and they're the ones who are more likely to leave.
All right, and Joanne asks, what is a freeman?
Essentially, a freeman is given the rights of being a free man. He can vote. He can elect the government of his town and city. He has the right to trade in his city, and this is what it essentially means. You are granted the right of being a freeman, but it means something slightly different in the Anglo-Saxon period. It means something slightly different in the medieval period. But by the 17th century, it usually means you're a freeman, you can vote, and you have certain rights and responsibilities.
All right. I know that there are a few questions about kind of nonconformity and tax, so that's a perfect segue to part 3.
It is. I'm worried about time here. Are we okay for time on this?
I would keep on going, and if we go long, of course, as I've said at the beginning, everything is recorded, so if any of the listeners do need to step away, don't worry, you can kind of come back and watch the recording. You can jump ahead, you can pause, you can rewind, you can fast forward. So I think we should keep going.
Okay, fair enough. And I'll plow on. I put far too much in this for you, but I wanted to get it to you. So yeah, let's have a look at religious upheavals, and you'll see why I've added tax at the end of it. They actually do link into each other. Now, the times around the Civil War were a huge period of religious firmament. So the time leading up to the 1640s, and you know this because of the Protestant nonconformists who were coming to America in the 1620s, and so we have. It's possible to learn a lot about the Puritan ministers and the Quakers. And I just wanted to draw a few examples of things that you can find out. So particularly here for the Puritan ministers sympathetic to Parliament and those royalist clergymen, you've got Anthony Walker's an attempt to number the sufferings and of the clergy of the Church of England in the Grand Rebellion. And he gives lots of biographical information here. And he mentions, for example, Anthony Huggett, a royalist minister who was harassed and sequestrated by his parishioners, ostensibly because he assaulted his wife. But actually, it was suggested that his parishioners turned on him because he had been a very zealous clergyman, bringing them before the church courts. And when they got the possibility in the time of what they call the Grand Rebellion to run him out of town, effectively they did. Then after the 1660s, you have those Puritan ministers who were kicked out by Charles II, and they too have biographical informations in Matthew's edition known as Calumny Revised, a revision of the accounts of those ministers who were ejected and silenced in the 1660s. So these are some of the later information you can find out about clergymen. The Dictionary of National Biography The work of Bob Anderson's with the Puritan pedigrees starts identifying those earlier Puritans who might have migrated, and some of the sources he mentions within there are worth having a look at. For Quakers, of course we know on the next slide that many Quakers migrated to America, having faced persecution in England well before they came. In the 18th century, Joseph Bessie published what was known as a collection of the sufferings of the people of the Quakers, taken from records and testimonies. These are worth having a look at. If they had been persecuted by Parliament or the King, both sides found the Quakers a general pain in the neck, so much so that the state papers that I mentioned are stuffed full of records of Quakers being fined and imprisoned for not paying tithes to the Church of England. That's a tenth of tax. Refusing to doff their hats to proud men. So the state papers have many Quakers mentioned in them. A lot of records within the state papers have been extracted by the Friends Historical Society. It's worth knowing about Friends House, which is the major historical library of Friends records in London. And the Quaker records of births, marriages and deaths do survive back to the middle, sort of the 1570s, and those that have survived have been deposited in the National Archives and are readily available online. But they are in addition to the original records at the National Archives, Friends House has what was called digests made of them, and effectively are abstracts of all the surviving baptisms, birth baptisms, marriage and burial records of Friends, and you'll find those through Friends House and on microfilm through Family Search, the Society of Genealogists, and other good libraries. So there's a lot of material relating to Quakers in the from the 1500s right through to the 17th century. Parliament wanted compensation for any Parliament ministers who were plundered by royalist troops going through their parishes. And here's an example of what we call the records to support plundered ministers in the state papers. This is actually what they called an annual redistribution or a fine made in the parish of Compton Chamberlain against the estate of John Penruddock. The Penruddocks were a royalist family, and they had to maintain the minister of Maiden Bradley because he had been plundered by these nasty royalists. And so we know a lot about the Penruddock family. Sir Penruddock was a landowner. He dies in 1647 at the same time as this fine is instigated on him. And so we're not sure whether it's him who was fined or his son. His son was in fact a royalist colonel, and his son John, the royalist colonel, had two brothers who were at university. So you can use these records, the landed records, the estates that they were that were seized, the fines they had to pay when they had their estates seized, and to support things like the Puritan ministers. These records tie in to look at the families that you're researching in that period. Towards the end of the 17th century, we can get a real feel for how nonconformist was the parish you were researching, because in 1676 Bishop Henry Compton, Bishop of London, instigated what he called an ecclesiastical survey, although what everyone else would call a telling of noses. And that's almost like a head count, where you had to count the conformists, i.e. those who conform to the Church of England, and that should be the majority of your inhabitants, and the non-conformists and papers. And so these papers giving this survey are now in the William Salt and Bodleian Library, but they've been published and edited, and there's a wonderful edition by Anne Whiteman, and it means that you can literally look up parish by parish to see how nonconformist your parish is. So, for example, on the next slide, you could go to Frittenden, and according to the Compton census, the vicar of Frittenden, he says, I'm going to anatomize nonconformity in my parish. So I've got Presbyterians who wholly refuse society with the Church of England. I've got obstinate dissenters. I have Anabaptists, Quakers, Brownists, neutralists, Presbyterians and conformists, licentious people who profess no religion, and infrequent resorters to the parish, i.e. those who just don't turn up. So while this is towards the end of the period, you get a feel for, yes, this place has had a tradition of all sorts of different sects, and you might need to look up, what is a Brownist, and the point is that these are people who would try to distance themselves from the Church of England and were dissenting. And so you can get a feel for the level of dissent. Now, the records of dissenting nonconformist denominations that do survive are now largely in one place at the National Archives, in the records RG 4 to 8. And they include non-parochial, i.e. non-Church of England registers of births, baptisms, and some marriages and burials between 1567 and right into the 19th century. The Quaker records, the latter part of the Fleet marriages from the end of the 17th century, and some foreign churches which have had records in this country. And while they notionally can date back as the mid-1500s, their survival is incredibly patchy and erratic. They are pretty much all indexed on Family Search, Find My Past and Ancestry, but I think the best website to get into them is actually the Genealogist website, because it has the best kind of indexing search functionality and images of the early records. The problem being is that what survives can only be a fragment of what there would have been potentially to search. I'm sure there were many that there are, more nonconformists than are recorded. They've ended up at the National Archives because they were gathered in, given to the Registrar General. The Registrar General said, well, I don't need these. These are not formal records of birth, marriage and death, and promptly offloaded them to the National Archives, and hence that is why they're in the RG series. And as I said, they're online through all the websites, but the best website is the Genealogist to look at them. Now, because we have this element of nonconformists, and because we have the idea of Catholic recusants, who by the 1600s, we decide to be a more pragmatic way of dealing with them is, to be honest, is to tax them. So we're identifying nonconformists, we're identifying good supporters of the Protestant Church of England, we're identifying Catholics, and so how did they identify them? Well, let's have a look at how would they identify Catholics. They could be identified in what we call the recusant rolls. These are documents created by the Exchequer. That's why they're in the E records, the Exchequer. And all persons who refused to conform to the rites and ceremonies of the Church of England were, under an Act of 1581 in the reign of Queen Elizabeth, subject to be obedient to the Church or pay a penalty of £20 a month for their refusal to attend. And this refusal was called recusancy. And it came to be that essentially it's those who wanted to adhere to the old Catholic faith became more known as the ones who were refusing to attend church and were known as the recusants. And so this non-attendance at church started out by being fined, and if they didn't pay the fines, then they could have their lands seized. And so you have those lists in the recusant rolls of being the names of the recusant, the rents that they were due to pay, a brief description of their lands, the date the land was seized, and their names recorded in these memorial rolls. So we're identifying essentially recusant Catholic. And here you've got Peter Laslett, who is noted the total debts he has, the fact that he hasn't paid his attendance for his fines for non-attendance, and he's had his seizure of goods, land, and chattels being noted in the tax exchequer records. Now, many of these local recusant rolls are being published by the Catholic Record Society, and so you will certainly see recusant rolls being a good list of Catholics from the end of the 16th and throughout the 17th century. Next slide, please. Now, in 1642, the House of Commons instigated that you should swear an oath to support the Protestant Church of England. And they asked all adult males to swear an oath of allegiance to the Protestant Church, and their names were to be inscribed in a list in each parish, and the list should be sent back to Parliament. And in a few areas, in the West Country, for example, they not only noted the men, but they noted the Protestant women as well. But it's usually the men over the age of 16. And the protestation returns survive for about a third of all English parishes, and they act almost as like a census of all adult male names, parish by parish. They list, as you can see in the printed version on the left, all the names of the adult males who took the oath, and at the end they list the men who refused to take the oath. And this would be the head of the household, and if he refused, generally his servants and tenants would follow what the boss said. So effectively, these wonderful lists of names of men in the 1640s are fantastic. But also, you can see those who refused to take the oath. And here we've got Thomas Huss. He is I've just blown it up on the right-hand side there. He refused to take the oath, and he's refusing not because he's a Catholic.
I think we lost you again.
Sorry, he refused to take the oath because he's so much on the dissenting side that he says that to take the oath to support the Protestant Church of England is a stinking relic of popery. So you can see he is really not happy, and he is a very ardently dissenting, vehement person. And you can find these protestation returns. Next slide, please. There's a good list by Jeremy Gibson. Many of them are published, so you can just do a search on protestation in the Society of Genealogists catalogue. And on the next slide, you'll find that the original records are going online. Because the protestation returns were lodged with the bishops' records ended up at the parliamentary archives, and these protestation returns are going online through the parliamentary archives website, and they are gradually becoming searchable. So now we know who the Catholics were, and now we know who the Protestants were. It's worth looking at tax records, because if you have recusant Catholics you can fine them twice the amount as anybody else. And if you have good Protestant men who've signed the oath of protestation, then they should put their hands in the pockets for all sorts of other taxes as well. And tax records in the 17th century are phenomenal. Next slide, please. They're in the Exchequer records, and largely they're in the Exchequer records at the National Archives in E179. So that stands for Exchequer 179. And this is a vast body of tax records. Next slide, please. And there are some fantastic guides to them. If you can get hold of the book Lay Taxes in England and Wales, 1188 to 1688, that explains exactly what was paid on each tax. I don't really care what was paid. I want to find lists of who paid. And what has occurred is that we have a wonderful catalogue of the taxes in this E179 set of records in what is known as the E179 database. But unfortunately, you can only search it by place. And you can put a search in, you can say, I want a list of all tax records, say from 1620 to 1650, or I've narrowed it down here from 1640 to 1660, but in Faversham, and I've just, what tax records are there? And you can say, please identify those tax records which have a lot of names in them. And some of the names they give to taxes are remarkable. They have things like subsidies and half taxes, and these are all odd, but these are all lists of taxpayers for that place. But what you can't do is put the names of the taxpayers into the E179 database to see if your ancestors were paying tax. And but if you've got a sense of place, you can look up all sorts of tax records. And the kind of tax records you can find, as I said on the next slide, we've got some fantastic names, like, would you freely and cheerfully gift your taxes to the king in 1625? Well, as at this time he was trying to raise taxes without parliament, he instigated this idea, give me a free and cheerful gift. In the 1630s, they instigated things like ship money, and then in the 1640s, you should contribute to distressed Protestants in Ireland and poll taxes. So let's have a look at some of these tax records with these wonderful names in the 1600s. In the 1630s, ship money was instigated to protect coastal towns and from marauding pirates and the threat of invasion. But Charles I decided he would like to instigate ship money in landlocked counties like Northamptonshire. And as you can imagine, this did not go down well. And so you will find some of the records of the lists of payments in the state papers records, and some have got into the Privy Council records, and some have got into the E179 records. So they're not all in one place. They're quite often published. I've got an example there of the list of people who were paying ship money in Walsall. And Walsall is in Staffordshire, again, another landlocked county. And they objected very strongly to paying this tax, but we have a list of the taxpayers in that town. Next slide, please. Now, if you had signed the oath of allegiance to the Protestant Church, when the 1641 Irish Rebellion occurred, which led to the massacre of good Protestant brethren in Ireland, and some remarkable bloody and gaudy anti-Catholic propaganda was published showing these nasty massacres, you were encouraged to effectively pay to the fund to aid distressed Protestants in Ireland. And while it wasn't technically a tax, it was a voluntary contribution. The records have ended up in the Exchequer of those who contributed to this tax. And so again, the aid for distressed Protestants is another essential tax list that you'll find largely in E179 and indeed in some separate SP28s. Now, Cliff Webb has listed those we know of, and there's also a Gibson guide which lists them. If you have an interest in Ireland at this period and your ancestors were Protestants and who were possibly involved in the Irish rebellion in Ireland, the witness statements, the depositions that they made in about the rebellion have gone online through Trinity College. And that's a brilliant website to have a look at. And if you have, and because Cromwell's activities, next slide, please. And because Cromwell's activities in Ireland to put down the rebellion were brutal and actually had their roots in the later real troubles in Ireland much later on, there's lots of 17th century records of the grants of the Cromwellian settlement in Ireland, where he issued land grants to English soldiers who stayed on after the rebellion, and of course what they call the Census of Islands and the Civil Survey of Ireland and the papers of the Duke of Ormond. There are quite a lot of Irish records. I know this is an English talk, but everyone, normally when I start talking about the payment of tax to support the Irish Protestants, they keep asking me about Ireland, so I thought I always knew that was going to come up. At certain periods in history, we've tried to instigate what were called poll taxes, which is essentially everybody pays a flat tax. That never goes down well. We had medieval riots against the poll tax in the 1340s. We had riots against the poll tax in Margaret Thatcher's time in the 1980s. And another poll tax time was between 1641 and 1660, where this laid down a sum was to be paid by everybody over the age of 16, not in receipt of alms for being poor. The lowest people contributed sixpence, the highest paid 100, and Catholics paid double. And so literally you have a list of people. In here we've got the 100 of the parish of Wadston in Buckinghamshire, I think this is. And you've got the Lady Dormer. She was rated £20, being the highest taxpayer in the parish. But because she was a recusant Catholic, she was charged double. So if you see somebody being paid double in the tax lists, then that's a clue they're Catholic recusants. And effectively, these are in some places when you look at them, they are almost like a census. You get the head of the household, his wife, his children, his servants, a break, the next household. And you can identify them almost like a census of all the taxpayers, men and women, except for the very poor. Some are online and they're starting to go online. The universities are getting to interest them. So, for example, Canterbury's put the poll tax online through the local university. Again, this is something you can search by name. Again, if you go on to the next slide, this is one you can actually search for taxpayers. And this is, and while not every parish is online or every town is online, it's so worth looking back to start looking for these name-rich lists. Carrying on. In London, my good old friend, the Reverend T.C. Dale, he started to look at the poll tax for the City of London, and he started writing those out. These are not online yet, I'm afraid. We have them in typescripts in the Society. I hope that we will get them online one day, but I just put them up to show that there were tax lists for the City of London, and you can start looking for these name-rich lists. Moving away from the 1640s and after the Restoration, King Charles II started trying more innovative ways of raising taxes, and they decided they'd have what they called a hearth tax, and it literally was a tax for how many chimneys and hearths you had in your house. The poor were essentially exempt, but everybody had a hearth, and therefore pretty much everybody should be paying this tax. And so we have, even though it was inefficient and didn't raise very much money, it did generate very good names of lists of taxpayers. So between 1662 and 1689, we've got fantastic lists of people paying the hearth tax. And again, these are starting to go online. Next slide, please. They're being published by the British Record Society, and there's a very good guide by Jeremy Gibson to all surviving hearth tax records. And those books published by the British Record Society are gradually being put onto a website called Hearth Tax Digital, which intends to be the resting place for those names in the hearth tax. There's going to be at least one hearth tax for every county published between 1662 and 1689. It's not there yet. It's worth keeping an eye on them because it will grow. But if you are interested in London and Westminster, these books have been published by British History Online, which is a free website, and again, fantastic resource for anyone researching sort of London and the city in the sort of post-Civil War period. I've gone on far too long. It's half an hour later than I expected. I'm ever so sorry. I am happy to answer questions, but of course, feel free to contact me if I'm leaving it too late. But I can pause there again.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Elsa. I mean, we appreciate your time. And as I mentioned, this is recorded. So if people did need to step away, or if you just need to review anything because we've gone over so much, you always have a recording of this until the end of February. So yes, we do have a few questions. So Fran asks, would you find some of these tax lists on Find My Past? And if not, which are the best sites? I mean, you went over several sites, so.
Yeah, I think some of the sites that you see in the slides, one thing that Find My Past isn't really good is for England in the 17th century. The problem with 17th century is the universities are interested in it. So you've got these various, Canterbury University and the Hearth Tax Project, and they're not working with the commercial websites. So I'm afraid, no, there's not a lot of 17th century tax lists on Find My Past, and not even on Ancestry, to be perfectly honest.
Linda asks, where would you find records of ministers of an Anabaptist church?
Okay. One of the things you might want to look at is possibly Dr. Williams' library, because that's a theological library for dissenting ministers. And there's the John Rylands Library in Manchester. There is a fantastic but old book published by the Society of Genealogists called the National Index of Parish Registers, Volume 2. And that looks at registers which are not Church of England registers, but it looks at nonconformist registers. And we published it in the 1970s, and I've not read anything that's better. And while it's out of print, we have a copy of it available to members on our website. And some of the sources that he mentions in there for Anabaptists, are fantastic. So if you're an SOG member, that book is available on our website. You might find it in the second-hand market. It's by Don Steele, and it's got a ridiculous title. It's the National Index of Parish Registers, Volume 2, but it's not Church of England registers. It's nonconformist stuff.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
And speaking of so many websites, Valerie asks, can you name the top 5 that we should try? Or does it depend on the place?
I'm afraid it will depend on the place, because the way the commercial system is working is that one county record office may have a contract with Ancestry, and another county record office may have a contract with Find My Past, and they're very much competing with each other. So your top sites, once you've looked at American Ancestors and every American site you can look at, is going to be Family Search, Ancestry, Find My Past, and the Genealogist. And then for particular subjects, you'll end up going down the university sites and all sorts of things. So, but I'd start with the main commercial sites. Someone just pointed out that Essex Record Office, every record office has its own website, and some which have got regular questions by American researchers for New England and migration. So things like Essex and Bristol and Gloucestershire and Norfolk have got really good research guides for Americans. And one thing you must always do is go back to the National Archives Discovery website. Discovery is the catalogue on the National Archives website, and as more records are being catalogued down to name level, what wasn't there last month is coming up this month. So you might say, oh, I went to the National Archives 4 years ago and found nothing. I bet you'll find a little bit more every time you look.
All right. And just one question on kind of for clarification, Catherine asks, so the poll tax, poll as in head, is that a per head tax?
Exactly. Yeah, in the sense of, yes, a head. Yeah, we call them sort of a poll. Yeah, take a poll, a head count. Yes.
Okay. Well, I think those are just about all of the questions. Thank you again, everyone, for your great questions. Thank you again, Elsa, for staying late and going through everything. There's a lot to digest. And so, as I've said, there is a recording. You have the handouts on the course page. And if we didn't get to your question, you can reach out to Elsa directly. You can find her email address on the course webpage. So I want to thank you again for joining us today. That course webpage that I just referenced, here's the very long URL. You will get an email from me later today once that recording is posted, but you can see a number of different resources and the handouts there on the left-hand side. And you'll have access to all of that information until the end of February 2021. But thank you again for joining us for the second class of our 4-session seminar. Be sure to join us next week at the same time when we'll take a closer look at some of the records, including those for the English Church courts. If you'd like to access more how-to resources or learn about upcoming online educational programs, please visit our online learning center at americanancestors.org/education. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I look forward to seeing you online next week. All right, goodbye for now.